Dear listeners, welcome to the Deep Journal channel. By subscribing to our channel, you can be informed about detailed reports every time. While tensions between Israel and Iran continued in Syria, Israel launched new missile attacks on Damascus over the Golan Heights. Unlike the others, in the attack, which was recorded as Israel's fourth attack on Damascus this month, missile batteries from the Golan Heights were used, not warplanes. It was reported that the target was destroyed with this attack. The target is said to be an important point for Iran and the Iranian-backed militants inside the Syrian regime. The way the Israeli army hit targets belonging to Iranian-backed militants in Damascus from the northern Israeli border in this attack gives a different message than the previous 3 airstrikes this month. Israel hit Iranian targets this time by firing missiles from the ground, and it looks like Israel's war attack exercises last week have been put into practice. On the other hand, the Syrian regime government blames Iran. Because Iran's deployment of thousands of militants, hundreds of tanks and air defense systems in Syria, despite being undesirable in Syria, is very likely to trigger a new war with Israel. This Israeli attack may also herald a new ground operation over the Golan Heights against the Iranian presence in Syria. In addition, Russia supports Israel against the formation of Iran in Syria and does not prevent Israeli attacks. We'll look into the details of the attack shortly. Tensions between Iran and Israel have been going on for a long time in the Middle East. Especially with the civil war in Syria, Iran's militant movements in the region increased and Iranian-backed militants began to cluster in the north of Israel. With Iran's refusal to agree to a nuclear deal and its approach to a nuclear weapon, according to reports by Mossad, Israel has issued a great warning string. Israel wanted its allies, such as the USA and the United Kingdom, to be sensitive to the issue against Iran's dangerous nuclear works, but the Israeli administration, with the negative attitude it took from the United States, which remained silent on this issue for now, was understood to be obliged to prevent Iran on its own. Iran, on the other hand, found these moves by Israel threatening and began to seize the southern part of Syria with Hezbollah militants and different militant groups it supports in the region. Iran has established military headquarters in many regions, especially with its strong connections within the Syrian regime army and its alliance with Russia. Iran then carried out serious arms shipments to these military headquarters. In order to respond to these advances made by Iran in the last 2 months, the headquarters of Iranian-backed militants in the region were targeted by the Israeli army. In the attacks carried out by the IDF, many militant headquarters were destroyed and a very important militant group leader was killed. After the agreements between Israel and Russia, Israel, which increased these attacks, almost completely cleared the Iranian-backed militants around the Golan Heights and targeted the Iranian-backed militants in the capital Damascus and the Iranian-backed regime commanders. The fact that Israel, which has carried out the 4th airstrike in the last month, carried out this attack from the batteries in the Golan Heights, is based on the agreement between Russia and Israel. It is said that 2 missiles were fired in the attacks and one of these 2 missiles hit the target. One missile is reportedly intercepted by the Syrian air defense system. According to the news from local sources, it was informed that this target was portrayed as an empty warehouse in the press, but that was not the case. It is emphasized that the target hit was a very serious militant organization and that Iran was an important checkpoint in the arms shipments to Syria. According to the information given by an opposition local expert, with this attack, a huge blow was dealt to Iran in Syria. He reported that as a result of Israel's preparations and attacks in the region for the last 2 months, Iranian-backed militants have suffered serious damage in the region. The expert continued his speech by saying that if Israel continues its attacks, it will completely break the militant power of Iran, especially in eastern Syria. The United States, on the other hand, has increased the activity in the region after the Israeli attacks. With the agreements it made, Israel left Iran almost completely alone in the region. A possible pressure by the USA on Iran in Syria could put an end to all of Iran's militant movements in Syria. At the moment, Russia has sacrificed Iran and does not want Iranian-induced instability in Syria. On the other hand, other Arab countries have taken a diplomatic and political front against Iran under the leadership of the USA. However, it is highly probable that a country like Iran, fed with chaos, will attack Israel with Hezbollah or Hamas militants before the nuclear negotiations. Israel is measuring Iran's pulse with this ground missile attack and is probably preparing for a new attack from Iran. Now let's examine the details of the attacks. The Israeli military launched another missile attack on Syrian territory tonight. According to information provided by the Sana news agency, 2 missiles were fired, one of which was successfully intercepted by Syrian air defense systems, while the second one hit an unknown target in the suburbs of the Syrian capital. Syrian state media reports no injuries in attack near capital, amid an uptick in alleged Israeli airstrikes in recent weeks. The Israeli military fired missiles at a target near the Syrian capital Damascus early Wednesday, Syrian state media reported. Israeli forces in the Golan Heights fired 2 surface-to-surface missiles at an empty warehouse south of the city at around 12:45 a.m., according to Syrian state media outlet Sana. Unlike previous attacks, the attack on Damascus tonight was carried out by the Israeli military without the involvement of military aircraft. Rockets were fired from the Golan Heights. This reduced the response time and reduced the effectiveness of intercepting missiles. The report said there were no casualties and claimed Syrian defenses downed one of the Israeli missiles. The Syrian military claims to shoot down incoming missiles after nearly every alleged Israeli strike, which Israeli military officials and civilian defense analysts largely dismiss as empty boasts. There was no comment from the Israel Defense Forces, in line with its policy of ambiguity regarding its specific activities in Syria. There has been an uptick in the number of strikes allegedly carried out by the Israeli military in recent weeks, including a rare early evening attack in the area of Homs last week. Wednesday's pre-dawn attack was fourth attributed to Israel in the past month. Several of these were allegedly conducted with surface-to-surface missiles, instead of airstrikes with fighter jets, as part of an apparent arrangement with Moscow, as the Russian-made air defenses being used by Syria have struggled to counter the Israeli air raids, embarrassing Russia. On Tuesday, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett referred to Israel's overall campaign against Iran and its proxies in Syria, while visiting an IDF exercise in northern Israel. "We are dealing with Iran and its proxies, in Lebanon and Syria. No matter what happens between Iran and the world powers, and we are certainly concerned about the fact that there is insufficient severity in dealing with Iranian violations, Israel will protect itself with its own forces," Bennett said, referring to alleged attacks by Iran that went unanswered by the United States. Israeli officials have expressed increasing concern over the proliferation of Iranian-made surface-to-air missile systems in Syria, as well as the Syrian military's improved air defense capabilities, which have made it more difficult for the IDF to operate over Syria. Israel has carried out hundreds of airstrikes inside Syria over the course of the country's civil war, targeting what it says are suspected arms shipments believed to be bound for Lebanon's Iran-backed Hezbollah terror group, which is fighting alongside Syrian government forces. So why does Israel keep striking Syria despite its neutral position? Earlier this week, the State of Israel fired 2 projectiles at an empty warehouse just a few kilometers south of the Syrian capital, Damascus. Earlier this week, the State of Israel fired 2 projectiles at an empty warehouse just a few kilometers south of the Syrian capital, Damascus. The aerial strike was the third in less than a fortnight and pointed directly at increased Zionist attacks on the country's northern neighbor. While Israel is not a direct participant in the Syrian crisis, it sporadically fires at the country, especially from Golan Heights, which it occupied during the 1967 Six-Day War. Why does Israel keep on firing at Syria? Israel's strikes on the Syrian Arab Republic are irregular and are often preceded by stray attacks both by the Syrian army and rebels on its mainland or occupied Golan Heights. Other times, accumulation or passage of army convoys near the 420 kilometers long Israel-Syria border prompts strikes, according to a report by Al Jazeera. Notably, the missiles or other attacks from Iran-sponsored rebels in Syria also prompt Israeli airstrikes and many times planned assassinations, a move that Zionists believe could prevent Iran to establish a stronghold in Syria. During his tenure, former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu publicly announced that he would thwart any attempts made by Iran to establish bases on Syrian territory that could be used against Israel. Experts have opined that most often Israel attributes stray fires to the Bashar al-Assad administration and retaliates with fires on government positions. Notably, Damascus last month, accused the Zionists of shooting dead Syrian Golan Affairs leader Midhat Salah al-Salah. Israel occupied the Golan Heights during the Six-Day War of 1967. Out of its total area of 1,860 square kilometers, roughly 1,500 square kilometers remain under Israeli occupation while the rest is controlled by Syria as Syrian Golan. What is Iran's role? Syria is a critical battleground between adversaries Israel and Iran. The Islamic Republic staunchly backs the Assad administration and over the years has bolstered its role in backing, training and advising Syrian troops. Meanwhile, Israel has accused it of funding and training Hezbollah militants which have assumed combat roles in Syria since 2012, and also attacking Israel from neighboring Lebanon. How long have Israel and Syria been in conflict? Israel and Syria have been at war ever since the former came into existence. In 1948, Syria along with 4 other Arab states Egypt, Jordan, Iraq and Lebanon invaded the region in what became known as the Arab-Israeli War. This triggered a civil war across Israel as a part of which thousands of Palestinians were forced out of their house in what is now termed as al-Nakba. The ousting further worsened the ties given the fact that Palestinians are primarily Arabs. Putting the final nail in the coffin was the 1967 Israeli occupation of Golan Heights.